and welcome to the Tudor Her Story. Today I am talking to Dr Charlotte Bolland. Charlotte Bolland is the Senior Curator for Research and 16th Century Collections at the National Portrait Gallery, London. And today we are talking about the wonderful new exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery, 6 Lives. Let's delve into the conversation. Hello, Charlotte. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me.
So in my introduction, I mentioned that you briefly work at the National Portrait Gallery, but would you like to just tell our listeners what your actual role is at the National Portrait Gallery?
So I am Senior Curator for Research and 16th Century Collections. At the National Portrait Gallery, we're very chronological, and so I just look after the Tudor collection. And in 1603, death of Elizabeth I, I hand on to my colleague, who is the 17th Century Collections Curator.
Wonderful. So today we are talking about the wonderful new exhibition, 6 Lives, that came out in June. Sorry, we're in August now. I'm still mentally in July. And it finishes next month, that's correct, isn't it? In September.
Yes, the 8th of September.
So if anyone's not been yet, you need to get down before the 8th of September.
Exactly.
But before we get onto the exhibition, I thought we could talk a bit about yourself. And I was wondering, when did you first become interested in history?
I think I've always, I'm very interested in it from school and thinking of history books and always being sort of opening history books and looking for the pages of illustrations and then being drawn towards that. So that's one of the things I feel so fortunate of working at the National Portrait Gallery, because so many of the paintings are so wonderfully familiar kind of from school and from history books.
Perfect. Would you say that you are more drawn to the art history? Obviously, you work at the National Portrait Gallery, but is it the works of Holbein and Hornbout that draw you more than the people that are at the court?
Well, so it's a bit of both, and because the Portrait Gallery is great because it's sort of it's portraiture, but also biography and history. And so I sort of has always known that I tend to think about art more as a historian. So I'm drawn more to the kind of biographical stories and the historical context than I am necessarily to sort of art theory and kind of color composition considerations.
No, I'm not. I enjoy art, but I wouldn't know any technical terms at all. So if anyone goes, "Oh, why do you like that portrait of Catherine of Aragon?" Yeah, it's lovely, isn't it?
Yeah.
What first drew you to Tudor history in particular?
Well, yeah, so had that kind of familiarity from school, but actually then in kind of my undergraduate degree in history, I was learning more about the 17th century a bit, and then also studied kind of Italian Renaissance. And then it was really in my PhD that was a kind of wonderfully set up, funded project in partnership between Queen Mary and the Royal Collection. And the sort of research question was looking at the Italianization of the English court from the Tudors to the Stuarts. And so where I was more familiar with the Stuarts, I was like, oh, I better go back to the beginning and start chronologically, start with the Tudors. And I sort of never left. And my PhD ended up stopping in 1603.
I mean, I've heard that many a time. People start the Tudors and they don't leave the period.
Exactly. Why would you?
Exactly. I mean, I'm studying history at the minute, and people going, "Oh, you'll study something else." Yeah, but it's not the Tudors, though. Is it? It's not the Tudors. What is it like working at the National Portrait Gallery?
It's so interesting because it spans, as I said, the kind of chronology. So I'm working with the earliest part of the collection, but I have colleagues who go right up to contemporary and are commissioning works and working with artists now. And so having access to that sort of perspective is so fascinating when thinking back to the 16th century. And then also because we're all about stories. So it's amazing kind of learning about new lives and new experiences kind of across the collection, across periods. So there's, yes, always new favorites to discover.
No, absolutely. I mean, I obviously went to the exhibition in June and I absolutely loved it. And I've always loved the National Portrait Gallery. I always think it's so beautifully laid out, especially since it's been back open as well.
Yes, well, that's great to hear. Thank you.
No problem. So I thought, firstly, would you like to tell the listeners what the exhibition actually is?
Mhm. So the exhibition is called Six Lives, The Stories of Henry VIII's Queens, and it's the first historic exhibition in our new exhibition space since the gallery reopened last summer. So I've been offered the opportunity to work with a much bigger space to play with. And so as a result, can really think about the Queens across 500 years of history. So at its heart, there is an encounter with the Queens as individuals on their own terms through their portraits and their possessions, but get to kind of set the scene leading up to that kind of moment of thinking about the Queens as they are sort of now in the popular imagination, and that idea that we all sort of carry with us, and that familiarity of the rhyme of divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and also the way their lives have been kind of performed on stage and screen, and also novels and history books. So kind of really meeting visitors where we all are in the 21st century, and then kind of taking back into the heart of the 16th century.
No, that's wonderful. I mean, I would urge anyone to go to this exhibition. I think I wasn't sure what to expect when I went in June. I
Mhm.
didn't know what I was going to come into. And I loved looking at all the, not contemporary, is it contemporary? I
Yeah.
think, the more modern stuff of how we view them
Mhm.
now, and then going into each queen by queen and seeing what actually existed in their lifetime. It was gobsmacking, and my listeners know that I am a bit of an ambling girl. So I might have cried when I saw the
No.
most happy medal.
Yep, yep.
I'm sure you've been told by many ambling nerds that they cried when they saw that.
And also I think that's what's, I mean, so amazing that I'm, very much a history nerd. And so in when you're kind of unpacking objects to kind of install in an exhibition, they're so sort of kind of resonant, and it's incredibly kind of charismatic moments. So absolutely you get that kind of brilliant shivers down your spine moments as you're sort of, seeing a letter that one of these women wrote.
No, I mean, absolutely. It was just absolutely incredible. Some of the items that are on display in this exhibition. Where did the idea for this exhibition come from? Where was it born?
Well, I think thinking, so it's been a number of years in the planning, because it always takes quite a long time to kind of put an exhibition like this together. And while the Queens have been kind of popular for centuries, and it's amazing thinking about how we kind of keep revisiting their stories. And I've long been aware that their portraits are some of the most popular in the kind of collection galleries, particularly Anne Boleyn, and she has such a kind of international kind of reputation. So you often, eavesdrop and hearing people, oh, Anna Boleyn, kind of coming in to look for the portrait. So they're people who people look for. There's that kind of interest in their lives, and really it was that moment of having the space to really think in the kind of full breadth of their stories, that it was that sort of idea of, oh, which historic shows kind of first in the queue. It's like, yes, we need to talk about these women. And it's so interesting how things can sort of change, because when we were first sort of thinking about the exhibition, it's like, oh yes, there's this kind of musical that's just transferred to the West End. It's in a very small venue and it's called Six, and we should go and see it. At some point, I've heard about it, and is now, in the years that the exhibition's kind of developed, become this global sensation. Yeah.
I mean, when I saw the six costume, I was like, oh, because I only went to see it for the first time last year after
Mhm.
it being big, and I'm going again next
Yeah.
week. I can't
Yeah, no,
wait.
and we've had a really great partnership with Six Musical, because they are just sort of down the road on the Strand currently. And so in including the costume of Catherine of Aragon in the exhibition was brilliant, to really think about how kind of costume and the kind of construction of character, and to show it alongside works from opera and from the stage, from the Royal Shakespeare Company. So to have that sort of conversation about how costume works. But we've been able to work with Six on great kind of learning programs moments, and they've been so generous with their time. So we've had lots of really great partnership with them.
That's wonderful. What were kind of the first steps that you had to take in making this exhibition? Because obviously it's probably quite a lengthy process to
Mhm.
start.
Well, so it's a kind of huge collaborative project, kind of in the gallery, and so that moment of the kind of team that comes together. So there's the curator, but there's the exhibition manager, who's the sort of producer who kind of actually makes it all come together. We have a brilliant head of design who do that, and an interpretation manager who also sort of checks that kind of storytelling idea. and also thinking about the publication that accompanies the book. So that's also going together, and it's a wonderful creative process as a team, because thinking about how you're going to tell the story in a space, and that's what's so particular about an exhibition. You're thinking like, oh, how will people move through this space? What do you want to see first? And so the big decision was deciding whether to put the historic section first or the kind of contemporary and afterlife discussion first. And then in thinking about the spaces and how they work, we're like, oh, actually, we want to put the kind of history at the sort of heart, as it were, of the exhibition, because it's a space you have to double back in. So that meant starting with the contemporary. So, and then everything kind of fell into place from there. And then you have the process of going to visit kind of collections all over the place to go and see works that you want to request to borrow, putting in the kind of loan request saying please, 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 and kind of institutions and private lenders have been incredibly generous to the exhibition. And then there is this epic logistical feat as people work out how to move these works, right, to be in kind of condition assessing and conservation treatments and all of that.
It sounds a very wonderful process when you're just on the other side of it, but I bet it was probably incredibly stressful to try and get all these items into the National Portrait Gallery. You actually lead into my next question. I was going to ask, how did you decide what objects or portraits you wanted to include?
Well, yeah, so there's that kind of long research phase, and I had amazing support from someone called Anna Clark, who was doing a collaborative PhD with the Portrait Gallery, who was, and we were sort of researching kind of unusual areas together. I'd be sort of, oh, Anna, Renaissance games. Can you go and find something else about that? And so just kind of thinking in all sorts of different ways. And there's that question of what survives in collections, what's accessible, what can be lent, because there can be kind of light exposure questions. So really, yes, that kind of research phase is really crucial, and then you kind of bring it together into a story, and kind of the focus comes in of thinking about like, oh no, I don't need every single thing, but this is how this kind of story can be told.
No, I mean, I think that you told the story of the Queens wonderfully, and as I say, I have recommended it to about millions of people that will listen to me ramble about it. How would you describe this exhibition now it is open to the public?
Well, the thing that I kind of was so surprised by, because I said, yeah, so I am not in any way a skilled designer. So that the kind of the feeling of the space, carefully planned and orchestrated, but comes as almost as a surprise to me as much as to the visitor. And I love the way, yes, the kind of spaces feel, the sort of grandeur and drama of the opening spaces, and then the kind of intimacy of each of the encounters with the queens. And that's a thing that you kind of always kind of comes together with an exhibition, that you have sort of multiple phases. There's all this research beforehand, and then the objects come together and they sort of start talking to each other, and then you think about the next thing you want to do and how the project that could be built from that. So these kind of moments of things being in dialogue with each other, which you can only realize once the objects all start being unpacked and installed.
No, I mean, absolutely. I think having these objects kind of reunited with their queen after 500 years.
Yeah.
if pictures could talk, they'd be like, "Oh, I remember that."
Exactly, yes.
When creating this exhibition, did you know that there was a story that you wanted to tell of each queen?
I think the key moment of the sort of thinking about the structure of the exhibition was that idea of the kind of thread of performance that really connects the way that we kind of their stories are told today, so much kind of on television and film and everything, kind of repeatedly, and then thinking about the performance of court life, and that this was actually something that they would be kind of quite familiar with themselves. And then also that idea of storytelling, so where we've often thought about these women in kind of they often become the stereotypes of their time, as it were. So if it's a 19th century historian, the kind of 19th century stereotypes will come in, and I'm sure someone will say that this is a very 21st century kind of perspective. But thinking about the 16th century and the way the women used stories to kind of shape their own narrative, kind of from the Bible, from classical antiquity, and that sort of navigating of storytelling and performance, was the approach that I wanted to kind of find.
No, I agree. I think when you're going through the exhibition, you can tell each queen apart They're
Mm,
not just 6 women that have been married to Henry VIII. They have personalities, they're
mm,
alive, they come alive in the exhibition anyway. When you were going in and you go into Catherine of Aragon, she's been portrayed quite often as the matronly wife, the older figure, dowdy, Spanish bull kind of, the real stereotype, which is frustrating.
mhm,
But what did you find in the records and in your exhibition when you've got some of the items on display that actually challenged the view of
mhm.
this?
Well, I think one of the most sort of charismatic things for relation to Catherine of Aragon that's so interesting is the wonderful letter that she wrote after the Battle of Flodden and the defeat of the Scottish army and the death of King James IV on the battlefield. And what I particularly love about that letter is because you have Catherine expressing informing Henry of what was in essence the greatest military triumph of his reign. It just happened while he wasn't there. Um, and that idea of there's a brilliant line that we kind of pull out as a quote of "Your Grace shall see how I keep my promise," which I think sort of says a lot in a kind of image of Catherine of Aragon and her ability to kind of hold her ground. But this idea of a queen who was not sort of the thought of military leadership, engagement in kind of military um, moments sort of wasn't in any way surprising because of the model of her mother Isabella. And the other thing I love about that letter is the way she describes how our Englishmen's hearts would not suffer it. The idea of sending James, but he'd been killed on the battlefield, and so she's fully an English queen, and she signs it Katharina, not Catalina. And so that kind of self-presentation of Catherine, you can get a glimpse of through that letter.
No, I mean, absolutely. It was so incredible to see that letter. And I think as well, seeing the book that, is it, oh, what's his name? No, I've got the
Erasmus.
the Vives one, the
Oh
one that
yes, yeah,
she
yeah, yes, on
commissions,
the
that
exhibition.
one.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I think it's kind of often misportrayed that she wasn't a Renaissance queen or she
Mhm.
was the proper, she championed women's rights almost. And
Yeah.
I think it was really refreshing to see in the Catherine of Aragon section that she actually was a very interesting, colourful figure.
Mhm.
And I think, and I don't know how you feel, that she actually should be remembered as the brilliant, strong Spanish woman that she was.
Mhm.
And she wasn't tragic.
Yes, exactly. And that's one of the things, one of the sort of really interesting portrait stories in the section of Catherine of Aragon is a portrait miniature from the gallery's collection in which she wears Spanish dress. And as she did in certain occasions when it was a kind of grand European stage moment, she would sort of demonstrate her kind of familial connections and power. And this sort of really small miniature that through working on the exhibition, that I do wonder if maybe Catherine may have been the key sort of patron and conduit for the work of the Hornbout family of miniaturists coming to England, because if they had previously been employed with Margaret of Austria, her former sister-in-law, so that idea that whether it might have been the kind of the connections between those two women that brought this new art form to England. And in this tiny miniature of Catherine wearing Spanish dress, she is identified as Queen Katharina Eos Uxor, his wife. And so it's a very deliberate assertion of her status as his wife. And I think that's so interesting with Catherine, of that way in which she fully agreed with, signed up to the conventions of 16th century marriage, of being sort of subservient to Henry in all things, to an extent which even sort of contemporaries found sort of somewhat surprising. Um, and yet the one thing she had to challenge him on was the idea that they weren't married at all. She's like, no, I'll agree with you on everything, but we're definitely married. And the kind of way that she holds that line.
No, I agree. I think Catherine was very loyal to her husband, to her family, but she was like, no, no, we are married.
Yeah.
Try and challenge it, but I'm going to win this argument.
Exactly, yeah.
When we go through the Catherine of Aragon and we go to Anne Boleyn, the second wife, and as you said, she's off the portrait people most often go to see, but she's often also viewed as the other woman. How did you want people to view her in a different light in this exhibition?
Mm. Yes, that's so interesting, that I think with Anne Boleyn, the kind of the tragedy sort of it, in that kind of and the way in which that for all her incredible kind of um, agency and power, that of having this extraordinary position of sort of being the one who, in insisting on getting marriage, sort of ends up helping, encouraging Henry to break from the church in Rome. This seismic shift in the country, but that sort of awful accelerated downfall of that kind of moment in 1536, and her sort of self-awareness of it in the kind of end stages. And that I found it sort of grimly fascinating of thinking in this exhibition about Henry as a husband, as much as any of the women as wives, that the way that he kind of leaned into the sort of melodramatic presentations of suggesting that she'd been having affairs with 100 men and having this kind of tragedy that he was waving around asking everyone to read. And you get this idea of that, his ego wasn't in any way challenged by what was happening because he knew none of it was true. And so this kind of yes, awful tragedy of that moment. And this is something that Dame Hilary Mantel kind of referred to in her Wreath lectures, about saying that of the last days of Anne Boleyn, that some stories bear retelling, they compel retelling. And there is, it is kind of fascinating and awful.
No, it is. I think Anne Boleyn is such a fascinating figure, but it's also, again, there is a tragedy to it as well, because you know how it's going to end, sadly.
Yeah, yeah. I did sort of particularly of the works in the exhibition, of thinking of kind of Anne's self-presentation, that I think it's so interesting, the wonderful Book of Hours that Henry and Anne exchanged messages to each other, and Henry's presentation of his inscription to Anne in French. She is the sort of French queen, as it were, and under Christ as the man of sorrows, because he's suffering so much in his love for her. And the fact that Anne chose the image of the Annunciation of the Virgin, so this very explicit kind of "I will give you a son," and so that I love that kind of glimpse of her use of stories to kind of make her case.
No, I agree. And I also kind of like in the Anne Boleyn section, you show her triumphs as well.
Mhm.
You show the Most Happy Medal and also the letter declaring Elizabeth's birth, which is also
Yeah,
her triumph.
yeah.
And am I correct in remembering there's a coronation not picture, but is that
No, we've got the amazing Holbein design of the for the centre of the kind of cup and cover and sort of fountain that he designed for her, with her falcon and stump on. That was, yes, a New Year's gift for Henry.
that's it? That's what I was
Mhm.
getting mixed up with.
Mhm.
But I did like that it wasn't just, yeah, married for years, got a head cut off, end of. It was, you showed the triumphs that she
Mhm.
did also achieve in
Mhm.
her reign as well. And when you leave Anne, you
Mhm.
go on to Jane Seymour, and Jane's is the only wife to have given him a living son, but
Mhm.
she's often the most forgotten as well. She goes into the shadows a little bit. How did you try to give her a voice in
Mhm.
her section?
Well, yeah, so Jane is so sort of so interesting, because she is very recognizable, because her portrait is instantly replicated sort of soon after her death by her family members, who want to kind of stress their relationship to Jane. So she is a very sort of familiar face. And I love that with the portrait that we have on her, which is from Holbein's studio. And it's this small image, and it's exquisitely beautiful, from the Moritz house. And because of its scale, it sort of draws you in. But however kind of close you get, she's still sort of far away. And I really love that as a way of thinking about Jane, because we have so little trace of her as an individual. We have none of her books or letters or kind of anything. And so thinking about that I really wanted to make the case of her sort of enduring presence at court through her emblems and coats of arms that kind of weren't removed, in unlike those of Anne Boleyn and Catherine of Aragon, but that she is this sort of commemorated and rather kind of static sort of presence in a way that is impossible to kind of know anything about. But I do kind of wonder about Jane, who has gone down in occasionally been classified as a sort of as a doormat, and her motto of "bound to obey and serve" is somewhat horrifying in a way. But I do think that she must have been fairly ambitious, and the fact that both of her brothers would ultimately end up being executed, that you wonder, had Jane lived, what personality might she have been kind of remembered for? But instead, she is this sort of, yes, kind of blank space that people have just repasted her portrait again and again, but not really kind of got close to her as an individual.
No, I completely agree. I think if she survived, and obviously she gave a son, so she would have been safe for the time being. She might have given Henry more sons.
Mhm.
I think we might have known a bit more of the personality
Mm.
that she didn't show us. I, I personally think she did that on purpose. She didn't
Mhm.
want to show a personality.
That that it was interesting of thinking about that idea of storytelling, that I wonder if she might have used the story of Mary Magdalene as her kind of names, because whereas the Catherines and Annes had kind of St. Catherine and St. Anne to sort of model themselves on, or to kind of perform as, there's no St. Jane. And so in choosing Mary Magdalene, and if there might have been some sort of pointed moments of styling herself in very much a kind of counter to Anne narrative, where opportunities have. But the only kind of pageant that we have for her is this sort of brief description of one when she was announced as queen. But of course, her kind of coronation, which would have been the great moment where we might have perhaps seen the stories that she wanted to tell about herself, was cancelled because of plague. And so it was, yes, the kind of a gap that never happened.
No, yes, absolutely. When we finish with Jane, of course, we get onto Anne of Cleves,
Mhm.
the shortest marriage of Henry's wives. Did you have to? You didn't have to, but did you feel you had to choose items that were also outside of her queenship? Because obviously she's the one that truly survived.
Mhm. Yes, and so it's hard that there aren't kind of that many pieces that survive, but we're really fortunate to be able to include, on loan from Hever, this wonderful panel with AC, and again that idea of self-presentation, and so how Anne kind of, and we have it displayed next to an account book from her time as queen. So you have there that sort of book which is endorsed at the bottom of each page as kind of Anne the Queen, and then that, shift in her identity kind of back to her youth, her kind of pre-marriage, of being like, AC, I'm Anna of Cleves, that's who I am now as the king's sister. And so it was really excited to be able to have that kind of juxtaposition in the exhibition.
No, absolutely. That panel is so beautiful, and
Mm.
I think it's interesting to see how she styled herself
Mhm.
after the marriage. But I also found it interesting in her section how she lived that 6 months to the fall
Yes.
as Queen of England. So I'm going to use it to every advantage possible.
Exactly. The account books are kind of wonderful, of the gifts that she receives and the jewels that she commissions and the clothes, and then all the kind of payments to musicians and gambling debts. So yes, she had a good time in the kind of window of being as queen, and kind of continued in her kind of the properties that she was sort of given by Henry in the kind of divorce settlement, and her more and more is being learnt about her kind of architectural patronage and kind of work afterwards. So yes, her really interesting time in England.
No, absolutely. I think she's such an interesting lady. I'm trying to learn as much as I can about her, but what I can find. When we finish with Anne of Cleves, we obviously go on to Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of Henry VIII and the
Mhm.
youngest.
Yeah.
There's been a bit of a mixed view about Catherine, even in her lifetime and then post
Mhm.
execution. She's either a victim for people now, or she's the good time girl that didn't have a care about anything. How did you want people to view her in her section?
Yes, it's so interesting that sort of Catherine, the sort of the way that Catherine Howard is remembered, it perhaps speaks the most to the sort of the preoccupations of the time of the historians who are writing about it, as it were. And so in the kind of in the 19th century, these very sort of moralistic judgments kind of her, and then today very much awareness of the kind of power imbalances and age balances in the early relationships that she had prior to her marriage to Henry. But one thing I wanted to do, and was so excited to discover during the research for the exhibition, was just a small crumb that just kind of gives Catherine back a bit of agency, sort of as herself, whatever her character may have been. In that is in the cipher design by Hans Holbein the Younger. And this is so fascinating because it is a cipher that was decoded by an American scholar, Vanessa Braganza. It did that incredible job of trying to work out what's there, and saw the words Henricus Rex Catherine. And of course, there are 3 Catherines who it could perhaps be. And I do wonder if it is Catherine Howard, because there is this fabulous reference in the inventory of her jewels to a collar or partlet, which has the annotation saying that there are 16 diamonds, and the note that 10 of these diamonds taken and set in a cipher by the Queen. And in this jewelry design, you can see there are 10 stones. And what's so kind of intriguing about this, that if that is the relationship between those 2 sort of surviving bits of information, is that it shows Catherine directly commissioning a work from Holbein, which is really interesting in relation to the kind of portrait miniature that's been identified in her, and that sense of, her as a kind of proactive patron. And then of all the things she chooses to sort of design, it's a jewel with her name in it. And so where Henry is giving her H's to wear, that she's wanting to create a jewel that has her name alongside Henry's. And then that this cipher, as described in the inventory, is one of the jewels that Henry insists on taking back into his own possession in November 1541. So it's one of the ones that he finds most kind of personally offensive and upsetting. And so I was so excited to kind of discover that, because it just gives sort of a window to Catherine making her own decisions as to how she wants to present herself as Queen.
No, I completely agree. I think it was refreshing to see a bit of a different identity to Catherine and a bit of a voice, because obviously she was Queen for 18 months roundabout, and she's kind of been viewed as that she just was dancing all the time and having fun, where I think she was a bit more serious than people give her credit for.
Yeah.
And I
And she
think
was having to navigate a very sort of contradictory sort of situation that I was so interested to read again in that kind of inventory of jewels, that Henry gives her at New Year these kind of wildly contradictory sort of, in the sort of symbolism of the jewels, of one as a diamond IHS, probably one that had belonged to Jane Seymour and Catherine Aragon kind of before her, but quite a religiously conservative sort of design. And then the other, a very anti-papal allegory of an image, an anti-imperial image, which was probably designed as a gift for Anne of Cleves that never kind of got given. And so Catherine, Catherine, in trying to navigate kind of court, is like, oh, right, how do I balance these 2 sort of things? And I think the fact that only a few weeks later she chose to intervene to plead pardon for both kind of Thomas Wyatt from the reforming side of the kind of factions at court, and Sir John Wallop from the conservative side, sort of just gives a glimpse of, again, that way that she was navigating the situation she was in.
no, absolutely. I think the Tudor court by the beginning of the 1540s was such a toxic place. And you'd have to have a strong stomach, I think, to have been in the court at the time. And for such a young woman as well, it must have been really hard to find your place there as well. When we finish with Catherine Howard, we obviously go on to the 6th and final wife, Catherine Parr. She's been often misrepresented in the media as Henry's nursemaid, and it's finally started to come through that she was not nothing of the sort. How did you want Catherine Parr to look in your section for her?
Well, there were sort of 2 kind of key areas that kind of Catherine as a writer, because it's extraordinary that she sort of publishes works under her own name at this period, and so an incredibly well-educated woman, sort of gifted linguist and translator, and so that's so sort of unusual to really celebrate that fact, and that which has been kind of much more widely recognized in recent years. Scholars have been kind of championing Catherine Parr. And then the other question was her interest in portraiture, because she was, of all the 6 women, the one who was most interested in portraiture, and commissioned a range of artists and different kind of media. And so being able to bring together those group of portraits, that I think she was perhaps the most consciously constructing a kind of visual image. And sort of to have as the kind of anchor for this, the most exciting sort of discovery for the exhibition, which is a work that hasn't been on public display before, which was a kind of half-length portrait of Catherine in black, with wonderful kind of jewels, that was sold at Sotheby's a couple of years ago and is now at a private collection, and yes, kind of on display for the first time. So being able to really take a close look at that portrait has been so exciting.
No, absolutely. Seeing that portrait was absolutely breathtaking, because I think it was believed to have been burnt, wasn't it? It was not.
Exactly. Yes, the collection, it had been in previously had a sort of devastating fire in the mid 20th century, and it was thought to have been lost. So it was a sort of a kind of art historical dead end, of familiar from black and white photographs, but assumed lost. And then it was in the sort of early 21st century, kind of a few people began to think, oh, actually, no, maybe it might have survived. And then, yes, it's kind of emergence for people to be able to take a really close look at it. And it's been conserved. And it was so in that moment that of uncovering a detail that had not been kind of visible in the black and white photographs we had. It was this tiny detail of the jeweled bracelets that Catherine wears, which has this inscription, Laus Deus, kind of repeated around the bracelets, enamelled. And Susanna Lipscomb's written about this in the publication, of that Catherine obviously being a very skilled Latinist, and so it's not a mistranslation of being Laus Deo, of praise God, that clearly would be intended as Laus Deus. And Susanna identified it as a quote from the Vulgate Bible of Tibi Silens Laus Deus, praise God in silence. And it's so fascinating to think about whether this might be a sort of a play on the conventions of portraiture. So her silent figure is nonetheless still praising God within this painting. But also because of what happens to Catherine and her sort of narrow escape, as later reported by kind of the Elizabethans and John Fox, her narrow escape from arrest and possible execution for heresy, and that idea of her sort of silencing herself to survive. And if that is a kind of glimpse of that self-presentation in this tiny detail in this portrait.
No, that's really fascinating. Thank you for telling me that. Anyway, I'm sure my listeners will be happy, but I'm happy for knowing. Would you say that Catherine, obviously there's quite a few portraits of Catherine Parr, that she was very savvy of the fact of getting your image out as queen was important?
Mm. Yes, I think, and researchers and scholars have kind of wondered about her, how proactive she was in relation to thinking about a role in the regency, that should Edward VI come to the throne as a boy, if she was kind of positioning herself as a figure who could conceivably be take on a role within a regency. I think interestingly that her love of miniatures might well have come from Catherine of Aragon, as this kind of loop, which is reflected in the kind of layout of the exhibition. But the fact that Catherine Parr was likely named after Catherine of Aragon, who was probably her godmother, and that Catherine Parr, this is where it gets confusing with all the Catherines to try and tell the story, but Catherine Parr received as a gift from her mother Maud, who had served Catherine of Aragon, a pair of miniatures of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. And that a few months after Catherine Parr first turns up at the English court, probably in the service of Princess Mary, that in Mary's inventory, there is suddenly an inventory of her jewels, a tablet with images of Henry and Catherine of Aragon turns up in Mary's inventory. And I do wonder if this was actually Catherine giving her the gift that she had received from her mother, because Mary, the way that she was treated in the sort of late 1520s and 1530s as the divorce was happening, and the fact that the Henry and Catherine of Aragon's marriage was sort of erased from the records and did not happen, that a paired miniature would have been such a sort of charged and powerful object. I don't think she would have been able to keep hold of it. And so this idea perhaps of Catherine building a relationship with her future stepdaughter through portraits, through portrait miniatures, I think is so fascinating.
No, I mean, I absolutely. as you were saying, then they start to interlink, which you've got on the when you walk into the
Mm.
exhibition, you've got all the wires and how they link, and
Yes.
it's a bit like EastEnders once you start going into it.
Yeah.
Like, wait, she is the godmother. When we leave Catherine Pot, obviously, I think I've gone backwards. Obviously, you go into the is it Hiroshima? No.
Hiroshi Sugimoto, yeah.
Sorry, yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. And it's his black and white wax
Mhm.
figure portraits, and then we go through the modern contemporaries.
Yeah.
I thought, did you want to talk about how the Agnes Strickland books? Because
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting.
Yes, so that's one of the things of thinking about the way that history sort of works is one of the interesting things that the stories of these women kind of throws up. So we have in the exhibition displayed three volumes of Agnes Strickland's Lives of the Queens of England. And what I particularly wanted to draw out from them, which, you know, kind of wonderfully illustrated with their portraits, so the way that the Queen's portraits have been used to tell their stories throughout history, is the way in which the kind of the tone of um, the period in which any historian is writing is reflected, rather than necessarily a kind of truth about the 16th century. So Agnes Strickland's writing is very much has this kind of moralizing Victorian moment, but it's also a fabulous example of the way in which kind of history, the historical imagination and fiction kind of all get sort of close together, because with the Tudors we have this sort of shared history moment of you know, the facts of certain events, but, you know, kind of pure, as it were, historians always want to kind of push that a little bit further to kind of go with these two bits of information to interpret how this you know, what that might have meant, what it might have signified, why people might have acted that way. And then this gets kind of close. That use of the historical imagination is exactly what fiction writers are then doing. And so someone like Hilary Mantel, of her extensive research, and then using it to kind of go further and to give voice to these individuals from history. So the Queens of England is so interesting of thinking about that kind of fact and fiction and the kind of way they overlay and interplay in particularly in the stories of the Tudors.
No, absolutely. I mean, I found it really interesting to see how over 500 years there's been a different representation of them. Obviously, you have the Victorian portraits of Anne Boleyn's arrest, and then you've got the Hampton Court poster.
Yes.
And it's just such a wonderful random collection of betrayals.
Exactly, because there is also that moment as their kind of group identity gets sort of cemented. And so through that kind of rhyme of divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, so that kind of moment of when their marriages come to an end, when they are, to use Shakespeare's term, unqueened, and that is they've been kind of commemorated by one word. And equally, their portraits have all been homogenized often into sets to make sets of stamps. And that kind of is as flattening and reductive as the rhyme in a way, because you don't get any sense of scale or the kind of materiality or the original function of the portrait. They're just all part of a group. And so to kind of, you know, recognize at the outset of the exhibition the way this sort of group identity of the six wives has sort of overwhelmed an encounter with them as individuals.
No, I completely agree. I think they get grouped together, as you say, and we've often forgotten to look at them as the individuals that they were in their lifetime. What should visitors take from this exhibition?
Well, yes. So I think that kind of awareness of how, yes, as I said, how history works, how portraiture works, and that sort of, you know, a questioning of that kind of information. So, but also, I hope, kind of, you know, enjoyment of kind of leaning into the suggestible kind of encounter, because that it's got kind of beautiful colours, beautiful lighting that we really want to sort of recognize that moment of how special it can be to sort of see historical objects. And that I really appreciate the fact that in the exhibition is in all the sections dedicated to each of the queens, even if you sort of read none of the words on the wall, just by going through a space dedicated to distinct people, you can't help but get a sense of their individuality, and just the kind of time it takes. So I think it's always so wonderful the way you kind of move through an exhibition, that you can learn so much from that, just even in that moment.
No, absolutely. I completely agree. Why is it important to highlight the 6 women who became Henry's queens? Obviously, you have touched on it a bit, but why is it significant in 2024 to do that?
Well, yes, I think yes, and so thinking of the way in which this exhibition will be kind of looked back on in the in the future by someone looking back from 2050 of saying, oh, that was so 2024, um, and I think there is of course a real interest and appetite in sort of recovering women's stories and of encountering people as individuals, and to sort of yes have a different perspective to kind of flip the lens. And it's been so interesting for I found it because just having that focus on each of the queens as the sort of the person whose story you're telling, that the crumbs that have emerged around certain sort of famous objects or artists. So in relation to kind of Holbein carrying a book to deliver to Catherine of Aragon, or yes, those kind of little crumbs of moments come from just paying attention in a different way. And I think there's a real appetite and interest for that at this moment.
No, I agree. I think it's, in fact, as you say, it's very 2024 that we are bringing back voices to the women who have been kind of brushed over. Obviously, the Tudors are a much loved
Hmm.
dynasty.
Hmm.
They're always being talked about, but I think, as you say, it's kind of forgotten about the 6 women who were crucial in that
Yes.
time. Before I let you go, I would like to ask you 5 fun Tudor questions.
Mhm.
So, firstly, have you got a Tudor pet peeve?
I do have one pet peeve. I realized this of myself the other day, and kind of how quickly I had sent off a rather irate response to something, and that's in relation to Mary and the whole kind of world, the continuation of the sort of Bloody Mary narrative is my pet peeve, because I think that she had such a sort of challenging kind of childhood, and the kind of way in which she has been framed is entirely through the lens of kind of her sort of Protestant successors, and kind of that the way she's been condemned in history, I raise an eyebrow at and want to kind of champion her as England's first queen regnant.
No, I agree. I think it's outdated for this Bloody Mary title, and she gets a bad rep, and I don't
Mhm.
know why.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
Have you got a favorite history book? It can be fiction or non-fiction.
Well, have to say that I think I would go in this context, in sort of Tudor world, of actually fiction, and in relation to the C.J. Sansom Shardlake series, that it's kind of a rare moment of thinking like, oh, what am I going to read for pleasure? Do I really want to kind of head back into Tudor world for pleasure if I've just done work? And those books very much did tempt me in, because yeah, great characters and a sort of fascinating setting without feeling sort of exhausting or arousing any kind of pedantry in me. It's just really enjoyable, great storytelling in a brilliant setting.
No, I agree. They're such wonderful books. Have you watched the Disney Plus series?
No, not yet, not yet.
It's very good. I won't spoil.
Okay.
Have you got a favorite history film?
History film. Well, yes. So thinking about this again in sort of Tudor adjacent, and I say this with slight trepidation because I haven't seen it for a long time and I must revisit it. But it was actually La Reine Margot, which is the kind of very dramatic and kind of gory and bloody French film from, I think, the 1990s about uh, Queen Margot and the kind of wars of religion in France, which obviously a kind of parallel story to what's happening in England. And yes, that kind of idea of Catherine de Medici as this sort of evil poisoner at the heart of things. It's big on the drama and had an impact a lot.
I mean, it sounds brilliant. I need to see if I can find that somewhere.
It's fairly dramatic. There many people die in terrible ways, which oddly seems appropriate for the 16th century.
It does, to be fair. Have you got a favourite historical object or artifact?
Well, so again, in sort of Tudor focus, and to pick one from the exhibition, because it's been the sort of focus of my thoughts in recent years. There's a wonderful book in the exhibition that is from Elton Hall, on loan from Elton Hall, and it's a copy of Catherine Parr's Psalms or Prayers. So the book that she published in 1544, and it's lavishly printed on vellum, and so one of the kind of high status kind of elite copies. And what I love it for is that, so not only is fascinating as Catherine's a writer in this publication, it has her prayer for men going to battle, but is the sort of family history contained within it, because it's bound together with a copy of Thomas Cranmer's Exhortation to Prayer. And so the copy of Psalms or Prayers has an inscription on the frontispiece from Henry VIII, saying, exhorting the reader to remember him as they do pray. The copy of an Exhortation to Prayer has an inscription from Mary to Catherine Parr, and I think their relationship is so interesting, because you would think of them as being like, oh gosh, the Catholic and the religious reformer, but they were clearly incredibly close and sort of supportive of each other. And then sort of most chillingly, an inscription that looks to be in the young Princess Elizabeth's hand of T. Seymour, vanity, vanity, all is vanity, which is just sort of raises so many questions and potential sort of horrifying issues. And then the final thing, which I just love about this book, which is on just inside the cover, written in a 16th century hand that no one has identified as yet, but beautifully clear, is "I will if you will." And it's like, what is this story? Who wrote this? And so it's just, yes, a book that kind of is so rich and contains all this amazing personal histories and family relationships within it.
No, that's really interesting. I didn't realise how much was in the book. I'm
Mm.
sure someone's told me, and I've just gone, yeah. But I need to find out who said "I will" if you
I know,
will.
exactly. Yeah.
Who's challenged us to find
Yep.
this?
Yeah.
Have you got a favourite history fact?
Oh, yes. So, that in researching this exhibition, I think the one fact, other than all the excitement about the kind of Catherine Howard inventory, the sort of jewellery descriptions, is again in the Henry VIII inventory. So this amazing document that was published by the Society of Antiquaries, this kind of wonderful doorstop, which is the list of everything that Henry owned that was taken after his death, from kind of castles to napkins. And in the description of Oatlands, listing everything, it has a description, very detailed, of Queen Anne's bed. And so Oatlands was the palace that was rebuilt for Anne of Cleves, and it has this magnificent bed in it that's obviously so extravagant it's sort of been left there, and is kind of covered with sort of Cleves emblems. And in the inventory, it's got the note that it's made it up with sheets and pillows, which are embroidered with K's and H's. And I just love that idea, because you always think of these women of kind of having to what they thought of their predecessors, and all the kind of layers of this incredibly kind of fraught family. And just in that one little kind of, detailed list of description of a bed, you think, okay, there's a story there as well.
Yeah. How incredibly awkward for the both of them.
Exactly.
Henry had no shame.
No. No.
Thank you so much for coming on today and talking about your wonderful exhibition at the National Portrait Gallery. Any listeners that haven't been, I urge you to go. It closes next month. Don't miss it. I'm going again next week. So don't miss it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been so great to talk to you.
No, thank you. If you enjoyed this episode and you loved all the others, please take the time to rate and review the show.